Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This event, How Can We Help Ukraine? It's something that's always on our minds, always on my mind, particularly for those of us who have family in Ukraine. So welcome to this event, and thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your solidarity. I'm an assistant professor in public administration at the University of Victoria, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this event today with my UVic colleague, Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk. And as you can tell from my name, Tamara Krawchenko, I'm Ukrainian and Canadian, and I have family there. And really the power of community and solidarity and the acts of, frankly, love that I've seen in the past months have really given me hope. And I'm grateful that we can chat with some of our brilliant student organizers today and also have inspiration from the ambassador to continue that. And I'm joining you today from Mi'kmaq territory in Nova Scotia. Meanwhile, UVic, where many of you are, is located on the territories of the Lekwungen peoples and that of the Songhees of Esquimalt and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And I've been reflecting a lot on colonialism these days and really thinking about how there is such a great shame brought on by living on another's land and a great deal to rectify. And anyone with Ukrainian heritage, we reflect on that, we know it deeply. And the dignity and resilience of First Peoples is frankly an inspiration to us. I'm going to hand it over to Serhy now, who will introduce the panelists and the ambassador.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Thank you all for participating in this webinar. And thank you to our audience for coming here today virtually. And the audience will, of course, be larger because we are going to record this event. And subsequently, it will be posted on our YouTube channels as well. So my name is Serhy Yekelchyk. I'm originally from Ukraine, but I have been here at UVic for more than 20 years now, which is scary to think about. And my appointment is split between the departments of history and Germanic and Slavic studies. In both of these, I do teach courses on Ukraine. I can tell you right away that the course for the next year is already full with a waiting list accumulating at an alarming speed. It's not for a good reason. It's for the reason of Ukraine being the center of attention because of the war. But it indicates something important, that we need to be spreading the word about what is going on in Ukraine. We need to be providing opportunities for Canadian students and Canadian public to get educated about Ukraine. And it also indicates that UVic is one of the leaders in this field. In Canada, we are one of very few universities having active, robust program in Ukrainian studies, which is well incorporated into Slavic studies and history as well. We also have strong support of our Ukrainian community, and I'm sure some members of this community are going to be in the audience today. Now, we have a very interesting group today participating in our discussion. I'm going to start with students because it's actually the aim of our event to give Canadian students an opportunity to respond in a way to President Zelensky's address to Canadian students in June, on June 22nd. When UVic was invited to listen in live to participate in this event, we realized that this is the sign of not only us being on the map for the embassy and for the UFT and for the University of Toronto, the primary organizer, realizing that we are at the center of Ukrainian studies in British Columbia, but it was also the sign of our students being prominent in various things related to Ukraine, not just research, but also public engagement, and of our community on Vancouver Island being involved actively in fundraising and volunteering and supporting our university program, and of course these days supporting the Ukrainian refugees, or to use the correct terminology, displaced Ukrainians arriving in Canada. Very, very significant number of them, a very significant number is already in Victoria. Now, so we have 4 students joining us today to tell us stories about what they are doing for Ukraine, how the war, how the Russian aggression entered their lives, and what the reaction is to the appeal by President Zelensky to Canadian students. And you realize, of course, that for the Ukrainian side, for President Zelensky and his speechwriters, the importance of addressing students demonstrates a very smart strategy, an understanding that students are the future leaders of Canadian society. And he has just addressed Australian students this week as well. So an understanding that students are the future, that it's not that the struggle for democratic and prosperous Ukraine and for a peaceful world is going to be a long one. And it actually is an appreciation of the role Canadian students and other students play and are going to play in international connections and in engagement and in volunteer work. So we have 4 students joining us today. They come from different programs. Sienna Vishavan is an undergraduate student in the Department of Political Science. And I have met her through other networks after I found out that she has been volunteering on the Ukrainian-Polish border, assisting Ukrainian refugees crossing the border. Devon Sereda Goldie is doing a Master's of Fine Arts, and I have the privilege of serving on her committee, but I know Devon primarily through our Ukrainian community. She is very active in the Ukrainian community, and particularly in the drive to welcome the displaced Ukrainians in Victoria. And Devon, for all her wonderful efforts, has been rewarded by being sanctioned by the Russian Federation. And as she says, she is proud to join the club of our ministers, parliamentarians, and prominent figures in community life who have been sanctioned by Russian Federation. So Devon must be perhaps even the only student in the world to receive such a distinction. We are happy, Devon, that you are a student here at UVic. Alicia Gajar Fleming is my graduate student in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies. She has no Ukrainian background whatsoever, but she joined the ranks of honorary Ukrainians in our department, and she does fascinating job on Russian disinformation campaigns and how to resist such efforts to manipulate mass media in the West. And then Hanna Protasova is a graduate student in the same department of Germanic and Slavic Studies. She comes from Ukraine. So she has a unique perspective on how Canada welcomes Ukrainian students, what Canada does, and what it means for a student from Ukraine to be observing the war, to be watching all this news from a distance from Canada. And of course, we are blessed with having a remarkable panel of dignitaries joining us today together with our students. It's the Ambassador of Ukraine, Her Excellency Yulia Kovalev, who is a recent appointment as an ambassador. So we are going to take an opportunity to welcome Ambassador Kovalev to Canada and to wish her all the best in her efforts to defend and promote the interests of Ukraine in our country. The first secretary of the embassy, Oksana Kezima, who works with the Ukrainian community in Canada and with other things. And as I understand, both Oksana and the ambassador had a very busy day today. The ambassador was speaking at the parliament. So we have pretty tough competition here for her time. And then from our community at UVic, we are being joined by Dr. Elizabeth Croft, the recently appointed Vice President, Academic and Provost. For those not affiliated with the university, it's basically a CEO of the university, the important decision maker. And Elizabeth only started recently. She came to UVic. She was affiliated with UBC for a significant period of time, but she came to UVic from Monash University in Australia, and we are particularly pleased to welcome her here. I must say that I've spent the best year of my life at Monash many decades ago, and that university forever has a place in my heart. Also, some of you in the Ukrainian community would of course know about Monash being the center of Ukrainian studies in Australia for many decades. So there are multiple connections here. Now, we are going to proceed with the two moderators, Dr. Tamara Krawchenko and myself, introducing or giving the floor to the next speaker. The only exception to this rule is actually what is going to happen now. because it will be Dr. Croft who gives some welcoming remarks, and then she would introduce Ambassador Kovalev. Dr. Croft, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sergey, and I really appreciate you giving me that very warm introduction and for inviting me to this wonderful and very important event. I am very, very honored to join you today, representing the leadership of UVic as provost and currently as acting president, as my boss is unfortunately away for the next couple of weeks. So something that Sergey mentioned was that UVic is really quite unique as being the only university in British Columbia that teaches Ukrainian studies. And we, in fact, have an entire department dedicated to Germanic and Slavic studies. And that, as you know, is in which Dr. Yekelchyk holds part of his professorial appointment. And so that means that we have scholars with expertise in Ukrainian culture, language, and film, as well as Eastern European social and political history, and so many more areas of significance. And we are very, very grateful to have knowledgeable professors like Dr. Yekelchyk and Dr. Krawchenko on our campus and in our community. They are sharing their experience, they are promoting awareness, and they are creating important space for dialogue and understanding. They are passing on their knowledge to students, and we know that they are the important people who are the future leaders, creating a better future on our territory here and around the world for our people and for the planet. And one concrete way that demonstrates how the UVic community is supporting Ukrainian students is our new Ukraine Emergency Doctoral Student Fellowship, which is a one-year visiting research fellowship that offers financial support to a PhD student currently enrolled at a Ukrainian university, as well as peer and faculty and mentorship and space on campus to safely complete their degree. And I think this is a really good initiative, a really important initiative to support students who are adversely and unfairly impacted by the war in Ukraine. And I want to take a moment to thank and recognize all of those who are involved in making it possible, including scholars, our donors, our staff, and our students, and just really raise my hands to you for that contribution. This is a very important time for us to come together and listen to one another, to support one another, and to do what we can to help others, not just in our local community as we do, but in our very important global and academic community as we reach out to our colleagues. And I would also like to mention that the UVic website has a list of resources and supports available to our students and community members impacted by this ongoing conflict should anyone need support. Today, we are very grateful to our many speakers for joining us for this important event and for this discussion, and it promises to be an extremely interesting and thought-provoking one. On behalf of the University of Victoria, it is my very special honor to welcome Her Excellency Yulia Kovalev, the Ambassador of Ukraine to Canada, and to welcome Ms. Oksana Kuzima, First Secretary, Embassy to the Ukraine to Canada. Her Excellency Yulia Kovalev was appointed Ukraine's ambassador to Canada and arrived on March 29th, 2002. She has almost 10 years of experience in executive positions in public administration and Ukraine's investment promotion. Prior to her current appointment, the ambassador held the position of Deputy Head of Office of the President of Ukraine, where she was in charge of economic policy development and coordination with international financial institutions. Ambassador Kovalev holds a Master of Economics from the National University Kiev-Mohyla Academy and a Master of Public Administration from the National Academy for Public Administration under the President of Ukraine. We are so pleased that you can join us, Ambassador Kovalov, and thank you to you and Ms. Kuzima and to all of our guests for attending this very important discussion. And so now I would like to invite Her Excellency Yulia Kovalov to share her remarks. Over to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to address you today, and I'm honored to be with you tonight. As a couple of weeks ago, we had a fruitful discussion with President Zelensky and the students of the Canadian universities across all of the Canada. And that is important because you are the future. You are the future of Canada, and you are the future of the all democratic world. And President called upon the students on Canada to be vocal and not to allow the politicians to forget about Russia's war in Ukraine. And I would call you also to look more on the war in Ukraine and to look more on how this Russian barbarism affected not only the 40 million country Ukraine, but also already causes a huge consequences to all of the world, including the food security, including the energy security, nuclear weapons, climate change. This is the biggest war on the European continent since the Second World War. And this war already put under the big question all of the mechanism of peace and security that was carefully every day, every week, and every year developed and built by all of the democratic countries. And in one night on February 21st, it all has been broken by Russia, who after this Second World War became a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN. And we do see that as the war going on, there is a big test for everybody of us. And first of all, the big test of being courage. And the big test was what is the real leadership? In the very first days of the war, the whole world with horror was looking what is happening in Ukraine. And to be frank, many of the countries and many of the political leaders were expecting that the country who is not member of the G7, who is not member of the G20, who is not the biggest economy, not the biggest army, many of them expected that Ukraine will fail and will fall in 24 hours, in 48 hours, in 72 hours. And they were waiting. And yes, we are fighting with the second biggest, as it was called, the second biggest army in the world, one of the biggest nuclear weapon country. But it is an important phenomenon that I would like personally to share, because I was in Ukraine when the war started. And many of my friends were the ones who voluntarily, in the very first days of the war, went to the armed forces and for the territorial defense. It is important phenomenon of the leadership of unity of the nation, which stand together to resist the aggression and to fight for sovereignty, for democracy, for the territorial integrity. Many of you learn about these values in the books. Many of you read history. Many of you read political science. This war in Ukraine is the history that being written now for 40 million people in Ukraine who are fighting this war, and also many countries and allies aglobe who are supporting Ukraine, standing steadfast into resisting this Russian aggression. And it is important to both deeply understand what is happening in Ukraine and what will be the consequences of this war, and also be vocal on that, because this is now the place where the decisions of what will be the further strategy of the world peace, world security, rule of law, and the other things are happening now. And you are the new generation. You will be those who will replace us in making politics, in making business, in foreign affairs. And understanding this biggest crisis on the European continent for the last 70 years, and understanding the phenomenon of Ukrainian people who are fighting, it is important because I think it will drive many things outside Ukraine and many things outside of Europe, and shape the work of many international institutions. We all many years took for granted that peace, that security, that democracy is something which just was given for us. We were never fighting for that. And I would share personally, I never thought that myself, I will be living in the country and protecting now the country who is in war against the aggressor. And it is important to be vocal because you are the young leaders and you will be the ones who will change this world for better. And since you are in the university and since the horrific things are happening in Ukraine, you have this chance to be vocal on the things important to this country, because that is a good test for everybody of us to shape the world for the better future. We are very grateful to Canada with the different dimensions, to the Canadian government that provided us support and supported with the unity of our allies. We are grateful for Canadian government because if there are the issues, we are discussing them openly. And I was today for many hours in the tough discussion of the Canadian government for the, we think, mistaken decision to waive the sanctions. And we do value this opportunity to have these frank and open discussions on that. We do value support of Canadians, millions of people across all of the Canada who stand for Ukraine, who help Ukraine, who is hosting many of the Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. And we thank you for many students and many of you who are today with us, because every and each voice matter. We in Ukraine do really know the value of it, because we are fighting on the front. All of the other country is actually supporting our fight for freedom, both economically and the humanitarian support. But actually, each and every voice matter to support the Ukraine. And I would like to thank you. And I would like also to thank you to the University of Victoria for supporting Ukrainians in these difficult times. And my special words of gratitude to you personally, Dr. Elizabeth Croft, for the special program that you just announced for the Ukrainians. It is important to know that Ukraine do cares of everybody from our citizens, both in Ukraine and those who are outside. We will win this war, and we need everybody to come back to Ukraine and help us to rebuild the country. And it is important that those Ukrainians who are now in Canada, we wish them and we would like them to have the best education possible, the best knowledge possible. We would like them to absorb this multiculturalism of Canada, this warmness of Canada, a lot of things where Canada can teach Ukraine. And with a specific goal, we would like them then to bring it to Ukraine. So we do thank you for your care, and we do thank you for your support. And I welcome this discussion. I do hope it is the first one in a line of many of the discussions, and it's my honor to be here with you. And I do believe that this discussion will help you better understand on how we can combine the efforts to end this war, to win this war, and to deal with its consequences. So enjoy the fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kovalev. Those are inspirational words. We do indeed stand with Ukraine. You give us hope and Ukraine will win. We are with you and our students are with you. And as educators, it's our obligation as well to frankly teach and understand Russian colonialism and its repercussions and how never to take, as you say, for granted, peace, democracy, and security in the world. So thank you. I know you've had a very busy day and we're very grateful that you could join us and inspire us with your words. I am now have the pleasure of opening the floor to Sienna Wishawan, who will give, we're going to have each of our students give around 10 minutes of remarks about how they have been organizing. So Sienna, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. My name is Sienna Wishawan. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student of political science at UVic. And I just want to start by thanking Her Excellency Leo Kovali and for Secretary Oksana for being here today. It's an honor to share this space with you, and for Dr. Yekelchyk and Dr. Krawchenko for organizing this event and hosting this space. It's an incredible thing that you've done, and it will be very beneficial to the whole community. So yeah, like many others on this panel and around the world, when Russia launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, there was a lot of emotions, shock, devastation, anger, and it took a second to process all those. But then immediately, I think we're all thinking of what can we do? How can we help? What are the ways that we can respond productively? And so I'd started organizing in Canada and doing the best that we could from here by collecting donations, raising some money to send over before a family friend who was on the Polish side of the Ukrainian Polish border contacted our family and said that there is a desperate need for hands at the border, that there's a call for volunteers that need help responding to the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who are crossing the border and coming into Poland. Up until that point, this is the beginning of March, the Polish people, as many of you guys know, had been incredible organizers and incredible supporters of Ukrainians when the war happened. Many of them took 2 weeks off of their work and just to volunteer to dedicate their time and their energy and their resources to serving Ukrainians at the border, opening up their homes to them, giving them everything from their home. And then after about 2 weeks went by, which was about the time that our family friend put out this call, many of them had to go back to work themselves so they could support their own family, which left a big hole in the support and a need for people to come and continue to respond. So that's when I went out on, I think it was March 14th, with my dad to the Polish side of the Poland-Ukraine border to assist at a refugee camp in Szczecin, Poland, which is a small border town right off the border of Ukraine and Poland, to assist the refugees and the operations of that humanitarian aid center. So that refugee center, the one in Szczecin, used to be a Tesco shopping center, and it just was completely gutted and transformed, just cots lined every room. And when I first got there in March, there's cots even in the hallways. There's so many people that needed a space to sleep and a space to be. And so we were looking at over about 1,200 refugees probably in one space. And it was hard to walk down the hallways at that point because you're stepping over sleeping people. And so it's just overwhelming, the amount of need and people who've been displaced. And Tesco was consistently full my time there in March. And when I came back, I went back to Canada at April to write my finals for my university degree. And then I went back to this Szczecin to continue volunteering at the center in May. And in at the center, it was ideally meant for transitional housing, transitional emergency housing for Ukrainian refugees. And so the idea was refugees would be picked up from the border or the train station and taken to the Tesco Center. There they would spend ideally 24 48 hours only. And during that time, they would be applying for visas, finding information about supports in different countries and where they should be looking to relocate for this time. Sort of get back on their feet, have a hot meal, have somewhere to sleep, rest, and sort of regroup, contact family members and things like that. And then after those 24, 48 hours, they've gotten their information, hopefully gotten visas, they would be ideally on their way to a different country, somewhere in the European Union mostly, or around neighboring countries. Where I spent most of my time was in room 15, the mom and baby room. And we had a lot of unique cases in that room, which with small children, it's a lot harder to travel and make those quick turnarounds of only spending 24 hours in one spot or trying to lug 3 children, babies around. So we had a lot of times families staying for a few weeks, so you could really make connections and help people. And so a lot of the work that I did in that room was with moms and children under the age of 5, just giving them a private space to breastfeed and take care of their kids away from men. And I was in charge of helping people get beds in that room, setting up linens, stripping beds, cleaning, providing mom and children with the supports that they need and resources, as well as helping them find information and visas, as well as helping taking care of their kids and keeping an eye on them as they needed a break or a rest or to go and get that information and apply for visas and that sort of thing. And at the Tesco Center, it was incredible to see the amount of support. There was times where we were very low on support just because of different constraints, like people have to go back to work, but there was always people coming, even if they could only stay for a single day. You get people coming, taking the train from Spain, and they drop off a big bag of supplies, and they'd say, here, I can't stay, this is my one day off work, I can't get any time off, but here's a big bag of diapers that I saw in this Facebook group that you guys really need, so here you are, please take these. And then they head off an hour later back to Spain or wherever they came from. And so there's an incredible, it was incredible to witness the sort of community-based crowdsourcing activism and support, that network that was generated, that everybody, and there's so many people. I personally have Ukrainian heritage. I consider myself Ukrainian Canadian, and that's been a big part of my identity. Which was part of the reason why I responded and went over to the border. But there's so many other people too that had no ties, no personal connections to Ukraine at all, but they felt so drawn or so compelled by the injustice of it all that they needed to do something, that they wanted to respond. And so you'd meet, like there's volunteers from Mexico, like they're Mexican, had no personal connections to Ukraine, had never been there, didn't have any Ukrainian friends, and they barely even spoke English, just Spanish, but they wanted to come and do as much as they could and help in that way. And I think President Zelensky in his address to Canadian students, it was a coy comment about Harry Potter, but it's true that it's very obvious who is Voldemort in this war and who's Harry Potter, that there's no room for people don't have a sense of, oh, I'm not sure about this conflict or what we should be doing. It's very clear, no, there is something, there is an injustice happening. There is a right side and there is a wrong side, and nobody wants to be on that wrong side. Everybody wants to do the best that they can to make it right. And you definitely witnessed that in Shashmal at the Humanitarian Aid Center and all the volunteers who came to help support Ukraine. Included in those volunteers, I actually met another UVic student who wasn't at this panel today, but her name was Lucy, and she graduated from UVic with I think engineering degree, and she was volunteering at the same center as I was, as she was waiting for her sister to escape Kiev. They were from Ukraine originally, but she'd been living in Victoria to go to school, and then she got a job there. And that was a really sort of serendipitous moment to meet another UVic student all across the world who was committed to helping and responding, and just goes to show how strong the Ukrainian community is at UVic and the students were responding to it. At the beginning of June, when I came back to Canada, I was it was a big shock, to be honest, to be back in Canada after being constantly confronted and responding to the crisis right at the edge of it in Poland and Ukraine. It really felt as though the war had been erased from public consciousness in a way, because compared to when I had left in March or even April, I noticed a big decrease in the amount of attention the war had been getting and the amount of people that were talking about it. And President Zelensky also mentioned that in his address to Canadian students, that this phenomenon. And I think it really has devastating consequences for the people of Ukraine and the supports that are available to them. I witnessed this happening in my volunteering efforts. For example, at the Tesco Center, the Humanitarian Aid Center in Przemysl, at the end of the month, the mayor of Przemysl had actually wanted to stop accepting refugees into the center, Ukrainian refugees, and allowing them to stay at the Tesco. Even though the center was all crowdfunded and ran by volunteers, the state was not really supporting the center. But he went so far as to arrest volunteers who were trying to transport refugees from like the train station to the Tesco Center, and resulted in so many refugees, many with young children, having to sleep outside of the train station on the ground out in the cold at night. And then I also think we see the consequences of the war being erased from public consciousness and sort of not considering it as much, or the implications of our actions with regards to the Canada waiving their own sanctions and with the turbine and recently. So I think one of the most important things that anyone can do to support Ukraine right now is continuing to draw public attention to the war and the needs of Ukrainian people, because we're already seeing the effects of this and the consequences they have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sienna. Now over to you, Hanna.
Thank you so much, Serhy, Tamara, for organizing this important event. And thank you to Dr. Croft, to Her Excellency Yulia Kovalev, and the First Secretary. I am honored today to join the team of my colleagues to actually to tell about my experience of coping with those unprecedented challenges that were posed by the all-out Russian invasion of Ukraine. I would like to start by saying that although I represent a Canadian university at this panel, I am a Ukrainian citizen. When the war started, I was a newcomer to Canada. I have been living here only for 6 months, which is too short a period of time to establish social connections that are crucial for volunteering on a long-term basis. That said, during the first 2 months of the war, I was feeling more like a refugee as a person who could propose help to others. I myself come from the city of Kharkiv, and my family members were forced to leave the city because it was and still is under continuous Russian shelling and missile strikes. In the first days of the war, I contacted my colleagues from my previous workplace in Kiev, and this is Kritika Journal and Publishing House, and our editors suggested that I helped them to translate the texts by Ukrainian scholars and writers who were reflecting on the events of the war. Unfortunately, they did so either under the shelling or trying to make their way to Western Ukraine or to Europe as refugees. And the text that I translated back then in March was written by a well-known Ukrainian literary scholar, Tamara Krawchenko, and I was astonished at how much my own feelings of those days were similar to what Tamara described in her essay. She wrote, and I actually want to quote her words here. I understand that one has to speak out as well as to document the things that are happening now. First of all, the everyday experience and the chronology of war. But I stayed silent. My current experience blocked my writing. I could not say I was at a loss for words. However, the words became heavy. It was only affirmations that stayed in them. It turned out that I could work with the past, but not with the present. Evidently, it was a sign of the war, a trauma that was not only emotional, but also verbal. Of course, today I do not want to sound all too pessimistic, and I would like to mention the efforts of the University of Victoria to mitigate the devastating effects of war. As Professor Croft today already has mentioned, the university has raised funds to establish a year-long emergency scholarship for Ukrainian PhD students to ensure that the scholars impacted by the war can go on with their research. And their work, I believe, will create a better understanding of Ukraine, its culture and history, both in Canada and worldwide. Also, I would like to take time to say thank you to the University of Victoria's community and administration for their support of my research project that I hopefully will be accomplishing soon. I would also like to mention to express my gratitude to the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies, where I come from currently, and to my instructors for their ongoing moral support that is much appreciated today. In particular, the chair of our department, Serhy Yekelchyk, suggested that I could join them to help organize a poetry event. And the event was well attended back in May. Our audience was happy to meet 4 Ukrainian poets of different generations and 1 translator. So as someone who comes from Ukraine, I know very well that the war against Russia cannot be won only by initiatives to support culture. This is sad, but true. It can only be won by skillful and committed soldiers and a modern weapon. That is why Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and all Ukrainians urge Western countries to give us a weapon now. However, as a person who is doing research in humanities, and in particular in literary studies and in history, I know that Russian decision to kill Ukrainian soldiers and civilians in a violent and senseless war started from Russian indifference to its own citizens. Russian authoritarianism today does not care much about killed Russian soldiers. And in this regard, Russian Federation adheres to the policies of Soviet Union that failed to acknowledge the real cost of victory over Nazism in World War II. The Soviet state was actually unwilling to acknowledge the enormous human sufferings and excruciating pain as a primary component of the war. This, I believe, was one of the factors that enabled the approval of today's war against Ukraine in contemporary Russian society. So for Ukraine today, the defeat of the Russian troops is the main theme on their agenda. However, Russia as a state will also need a long-term process of condemning and acknowledging all the war crimes that Russian state and army committed against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, as well as against its own soldiers. Without that, I believe real changes in Russian society are impossible, even in case of their defeat. The war between Russia and Ukraine is seen as a struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. And one of the main differences here is the attitude towards human life. Today, many of my competitors say, I'm proud to be Ukrainian because Ukraine is courageously fighting to defend its pro-democratic choice and its right to independence. I would also add here, I'm proud to be Ukrainian because in my country, human life is the greatest value. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna, for those powerful words. Thank you so much. Now we have Devin Sarita Goldie. Over to you. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate today. I am a 4th generation Ukrainian Canadian, and I consider myself very lucky to have been raised close to my culture and to my heritage. My family village, Lashki, is actually just a 30-minute drive from where Sienna was volunteering. I'm a graduate student studying intergenerational trauma in the Ukrainian community and the use of theater and the arts as a healing modality. And this war has greatly inflamed existing trauma in the Ukrainian community through the ongoing colonial attempts of Russia. I won't be speaking too deeply on this today, but we hear so much about the trauma and the incredible emotional toll that this war is having. And I can't emphasize enough how true that is. I wear many hats in our local Ukrainian community. I'm the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Victoria branch and the Ukrainian Canadian Cultural Society of Vancouver Island, which operates the local Ukrainian Cultural Center. I also serve as the vice president of the BC Council of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. I'm also the co-founder of Help Ukraine Vancouver Island, a collaborative inter-organizational project uniting over 15 Ukrainian organizations and their supporters on Vancouver Island. And as Serhy noted, I was also recently sanctioned by the Russian Federation for my efforts, which I personally take as a compliment and is an achievement I'm quite proud of. President Zelensky's remarks to students in Canada touched me deeply and truly inspired me to continue working to support Ukraine and Ukrainians to the absolute best of my ability. As my colleagues are focusing their excellent remarks on Ukraine, I will be focusing my remarks more so on what has been happening here on Vancouver Island and how I as a student have been seeking to respond to President Zelensky's call. I will never forget the day that the further invasion of Ukraine began. I was at my best friend's house and had just sat in on a Zoom meeting that remarkably included Justin Trudeau with the National Board of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. It was an incredibly surreal day to begin with, sitting in this meeting with such an important leader, and literally half an hour after that call ended, news broke that the war was beginning. I shed a lot of tears, and that night was very difficult. But the next morning, I got up and myself and the community got to work. The Ukrainian organizations here on the island hit the ground running, doing everything possible to support the war efforts in Ukraine and also to support Ukrainians coming to Canada fleeing the war. And even before the war began, we at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Victoria branch had been holding protests as part of the International Stand with Ukraine movement launched by the Ukrainian World Congress. We held countless protests in front of the BC Legislature, Victoria City Hall, and along Douglas Street, which were attended by thousands. The Vancouver Island community came together to rally with us against Russia's tyranny and genocide of the Ukrainian people. We also used these opportunities to advocate to all levels of government for further support to be sent to Ukraine and for further support to be made available to Ukrainians arriving in Canada. The Kiewit visa program, which was launched by the federal government, as Serhy said, does not categorize Ukrainians as refugees, but rather as displaced persons. And as a result, Ukrainians arriving in Canada do not have access to the aid that refugees are legally entitled to. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress has fiercely advocated for greater support to all levels of the government. The federal government has announced some assistance, including a one-time payment of $3,000, but this is far from adequate and much, much more is needed. I've personally had the opportunity to meet with representatives from the Premier's office once to twice a week since shortly after the start of the war, and have had the opportunity to personally advocate for support from the province. The government of BC has gone above and beyond, stepping up to fill in many of the gaps left by the federal government and literally rewriting policy to ensure that the province is able to provide support to Ukrainians. This has included many things, including a $12 million of funding to support the settlement agencies and Ukrainian organizations, including the Ukrainian Cultural Center, providing Ukrainians with access to hardship funding of up to $6,000 a month for 6 months, increasing surveillance for ongoing human trafficking of Ukrainians arriving in BC, partnering with Help Ukraine Vancouver Island to provide expedited criminal record checks and vulnerable sector checks for all our hosts and volunteers, and so much more. Myself and the staff of the Premier's office also initiated a brand new model of settlement support services here in Victoria, the Pop-Up Services Office, which has now been duplicated around the province for both Ukrainian and other refugee communities, including the Afghan community. The Pop-Up Services offices are run once a month at the Ukrainian Cultural Center and essentially provide a one-stop shop for Ukrainians to access the various settlement services they need. This includes Service Canada providing SIN numbers, Service BC providing MSP healthcare numbers and BC Fair Pharmacare applications, the Ministry of Health providing COVID-19 immunizations, information about federally mandated medical exams and other health-related information, and other ministries and organizations including Work BC, ICBC, Social Development and Poverty Reduction, the Ministry of Children and Family Development, and the Intercultural Association. We've routinely assisted between 50 to 100 new Ukrainians at each pop-up event, and I'm thrilled to see this model now being implemented in other communities. I'm immensely grateful to John Horgan's office and his staff for being fierce allies and for being willing to think creatively to find solutions to incredibly challenging problems. Our community has taken a tremendous leadership role in supporting new Ukrainians arriving in Canada through Help Ukraine Vancouver Island, most notably through our matching program. So as of July 27th, 433,000 applications for Kiewit visas have been received by the federal government, and 276,000 applications have been approved. So far, almost 68,000 people have arrived in Canada under the Kiewit visa, and 402 have arrived on Vancouver Island through our Help Ukraine Vancouver Island program. This number does not include Ukrainians who have come to stay with family who is already here on the island, or Ukrainians who have found hosts independently online. So my current running estimate is that we have approximately 600 Ukrainians who have arrived here on Vancouver Island, and they're situated all the way up the coast, all the way up to Port Hardy. The Help Ukraine Vancouver Island program matches Ukrainians with a host who agrees to house and feed them for free for a minimum of 90 days. And the expectation is that guests will find a job and accommodation by the end of that time. But many of our hosts have offered to host their guests for extended periods beyond that. We provide all our guests with a checklist of the most important things to do upon arrival and provide each guest with an additional volunteer outside of the host family to support them. And we also have resource coordinators who follow up with our guests to support them in completing all the items on that checklist. We currently host social nights at the Ukrainian Cultural Center every Wednesday night for Ukrainians to connect with the community and to seek support. And our amazing community has started many other weekly social events for Ukrainians, including soccer, yoga, self-defense, and more. We also host, of course, Ukrainian cultural events, holidays, and fundraisers. We recently hosted a fabulous picnic for Ivan Kupala, and we'll be hosting another picnic for Ukrainian Independence Day in August. One of the biggest challenges at the moment, of course, is housing. BC already has a housing shortage, and we have nearly run out of hosts, especially as the news cycle has moved on from what is happening in Ukraine and the needs of Ukrainians arriving in Canada. We have over 2,000 people on our wait list right now, and we're down to less than 10 hosts. We are urgently seeking hosts, and I encourage anyone listening on this call who's interested in hosting to visit our website and apply to host. I'll put that in the chat afterwards. We're about to launch a very exciting project, which will help alleviate this to a small extent. This Saturday, the Ukrainian Cultural Center and St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Church are opening Ukrainian Village, a 15-unit assisted housing residential building in Victoria, which will host 30 to 45 Ukrainians. This project has been made possible thanks to the landlords, Kiwanis Village Society, who are renting the building to us at cost, and an incredibly generous grant of $120,000 from the Victoria Foundation, as well as funding from the CRD and other community organizations. The Ukrainian Village will provide short-term housing of up to 3 months for Ukrainians who are not yet ready to live on their own. And we're prioritizing housing for single mothers and their children, the elderly, people with disabilities, single women, and people who identify as LGBTQ. We would not be able to do all that we've done if it wasn't for our volunteers. Help Ukraine Vancouver Island has over 350 volunteers who do all sorts of amazing jobs for us, including administration, social media, matching hosts with guests, assisting guests, driving guests, putting together welcome baskets, making food and crafts to sell, to raise money to send to Ukraine, and so much more. This is a really great way for students to help the cause. And I encourage anyone who's interested to get involved. There's a volunteer form on our website, or you can email us at helpukrainevi@gmail.com. We're also seeking financial donations, as much of the money we've raised thus far has gone out to Ukrainians, and much more is needed. We've currently spent over $200,000 covering the costs of the federally mandated medical exams alone, which run Ukrainians a minimum of $300 per person. If you'd like to contribute, you can also donate on our website. And the last thing I'd like to share is that yesterday, the Royal BC Museum opened a new exhibit in partnership with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the Embassy of Ukraine in Canada, entitled "Here We Are, Celebrating Ukrainians in Canada." It's free to visit, and it's a really wonderful opportunity to learn more about Ukrainians in Canada and the ongoing war. And it will be open to the public until January 2023. Thank you so much for listening and for standing with Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. Thank you so much, Devon, for your tour de force presentation. And now over to Alicia, please.
Hi, everyone. I feel very honored to have been invited to speak in this space and amongst such distinguished guests and activists here today. I just want to start off by acknowledging that I'm speaking with you all today from Kamloops, which is located on and is a part of Secwépemc territory. So I acknowledge the local Kamloops people who are at home on this land, and I also acknowledge my position as an uninvited guest on this unceded territory. Now, as Serhy mentioned, I'm not myself Ukrainian, although I am grateful to know that I now qualify as an honorary Ukrainian. That's lovely. Thank you. This is often one of the first questions that people will ask me, am I Ukrainian? And if not, how did I get interested in studying it? So I just want to start off by addressing that a little bit and orientating people as to my position within the field. The answer to this question is that I was introduced to the topic of Ukraine and Ukrainian history, culture, and language through some of Serhy's courses, amongst others at UVic. And it's a stunningly interesting place to study, especially because I was already curious about the nation state via my background in political anthropology. And Ukraine has a very unique history and path towards democracy. It's always towards democracy, regardless of any setbacks. Like we're experiencing right now. But it's a very interesting country to study if you're at all interested in contemporary politics and the formation of modern democracies. UVic has a great program for this, and that's basically what got me involved in this area of research. Ukraine's a thoroughly modern nation, and what we can see in this conflict is the future of democracy, of conflict, and of information. It's very, very wide-reaching. This conflict touches pretty much every aspect of modern national and democratic life. So that's roughly where I step into the conversation. Specifically, what my research looks at is where information intersects with contemporary conflicts and how we can better understand this. In my thesis, I'm creating a model for understanding the interactions of hybrid and conventional aspects of modern warfare in their present condition. And so the study of Ukraine in this context offers an important window into comprehending global conflicts in the age of information and connectivity. And just to clarify that a little bit, I'm going to offer some brief definitions here about what that means before moving into more reflection on Zelensky's comments, because it all sort of ties together. So the term hybrid warfare emerged around the fall of the Soviet Union and is contrasted against traditional or conventional warfare. It indicates reordering of the goals of a war as well as a diversification of its methods. So the reordering of goals is summed up really well in the following statement by a hybrid warfare scholar named Kęstutis Kilinkis, that society and not territory becomes the object and goal of war. Therefore, new instruments of war comprise a wide spectrum of political, economic, humanitarian, and informational means. And we're really seeing that play out today. So, for example, a political goal might be the goal of a specific ethnic group seeking nation state status. Economic goals, concern themselves with capitalism. So, for example, trying to ensure global trade and corporate interest by developing or installing new markets in conquered or colonized polities or nations. The energy aspect of this war is absolutely a part of that. And of course, the humanitarian goals and informational as well. So for information warfare is often used to manufacture partisanship, political support, and even to supply the battlefield with soldiers. So for example, by creating a group of people who believe in the goal of the war enough through stories and information or misinformation, so much so they volunteer to fight in it. And we've seen that on both sides over the course of this conflict at various points. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on President Zelensky's comments, and then I'll get into some reflections on how to help Ukraine and what I've been participating in the past 2 years over this course of this degree to help. So in his address to Canadian students, President Zelensky spoke about two things that really caught my attention. The first is that he mentions information warfare, and the other is that when he spoke about governments and people wearying of war. It was really amazing to hear him speak, actually, because he's a very savvy leader and he really doesn't waste his words. He gets to the point, and he's a leader that has successfully unified his nation even under great duress. So the first thing that caught my attention was how he spoke about information warfare, and he calls it by name, which is pretty interesting because you don't hear that term a ton in press on modern conflicts. So one of the comments he made was about social media, and I have a quote that I wrote down from when he was answering questions at the end of that presentation. So what he said basically was, social media is a space to cut distances It is an opportunity to share truth. It's like a weapon. It is a way of weaponizing the experiences of each individual in this war. It is about protecting freedom. And this is very much in keeping with his own approach to social media, where he's been sharing announcements and, updates on what has been going on and what global endeavors he and Ukraine are involved in, as well as photos and videos of occurrences from around the country. There was also, of course, the now, I think, quite famous incident of a Russian fake news site spreading the word that President Zelensky had fled the city. And Zelensky was able to debunk this by filming himself walking around Kiev with iconic monuments and partially destroyed buildings and stuff in the background. So he's making a very clear message that he's there and he wasn't going anywhere. And it was his use of social media that allowed him to debunk this so completely and so quickly as well. In his many public social media addresses, he has made a massive impact on global awareness on the war in Ukraine and has done a spectacular job at contesting Russian misinformation about him and about the war just by using his official Instagram account. So to put this into a little bit of context for everyone, I'm going to very gently pick on our own Prime Minister Justin Trudeau here. I'm not sure if anyone here follows him, but Trudeau's Instagram account is a really good example of a more classic political image. The photos are very professional and they're a little bit staged and a little bit stiff. There's a lot of shaking hands and children and that kind of thing. So when you view that next to President Zelensky's Instagram, you can really see with his social media that he's committed to using it as that space to cut distances and to give people access to himself in all of the new ways that social media allows for. So he's a very responsive and tech forward leader, which is interesting. And I think having that access to his person really makes a difference. And events where he's addressing students in Canada and Australia now as well, it is very personal and it's very powerful because of that. So for Canadians, one of the important things to pay attention to is getting factual information coming out of Ukraine. And I know that's something that comes up a lot in conversations of social media. How can you tell what's good information and what isn't? And I will get into a little bit of stop fake stuff in a bit, but not just yet. So one of I think probably everyone here has heard about the massacres in Bucha. It's a good example, but also obviously quite a horrific example to use for how social media functioned basically to vet information in the Canadian news cycle. So this is where Russian forces had massacred the civilians in a town called Bucha and had attempted to blame this on both Britain and on Ukraine. And a big part of the reason why Russia was ultimately unsuccessful in convincing the international audience of its lie was due to the pictures that were coming out from social media, from people who were taking pictures of what was going on there, or what had gone on there, as well as somewhat the sheer implausibility of Russia's story, talking about 2 carloads of British people coming in and starting the whole thing. And it was that part was very odd. But it's really important to note that while Russia is time and time again losing the information war to Zelensky, it has been a little bit more successful in its own heavily censored domestic media. So Russian disinformation machine is continuing to churn out new material every day. So Canadians need to make sure that we're getting good info from good news sources like The Guardian and Stop Fake, for example. And the other thing, before I get into all that, the second thing that President Zelensky mentioned in his address was that, and here I'll quote again, that everyone becomes weary of war. Do not allow anyone to forget about what is going on in Ukraine. Please don't become tired about the war. This is something that we need you for. And the president specifically mentioned governments and people becoming weary of war. And one thing that's come up a lot today, and that I would also add to this is that news media gets very weary of war. It gets, it sort of stops reporting on war after a while because it begins to lose its power of spectacle. It begins to lose its power to attract an audience. And of course, the one flows from the other. So spectacle relies on shock, which is something that is both new and something that is surprising. So to borrow a phrase from like YouTube influencers, for example, don't forget to like and follow. Zelensky's clearly stated the need for Ukraine to remain visible. So keeping Ukraine in your thoughts, talking to your friends and family about the war, and keeping pressure on the government to help Ukraine are all very important, but also to keep posting about Ukraine and commenting and sharing the news stories that you find that you judge are worthy of sharing. This is one way of keeping news media focused on Ukraine, which keeps a spotlight on what governments are doing for Ukraine. And that results in material aid being delivered where it's needed, which is what this is all about, because this is not a war that we want to be going on for a long time. It needs to be won, and it will be won. And it needs to be won by Ukraine, because the other scenario is just bad for everyone at the level of democracy, of society, of food security and environment. Ukraine is depending on people caring and government sending aid in order to help the fight and to win this war. So we all have to do our part. And as a scholar, I've had the opportunity to put this into action in a couple of ways, mostly through events like this or through going to conferences where I've been able to present some sort of similar information to what I've been talking about today, about information warfare, about hybrid warfare, and also drawing attention to what's going on in Ukraine. So I promised earlier to explain a little bit about what Stop Fake is. So I think maybe probably just best to start there. The first conference I presented my research at was at the Revolution of Dignity Museum in Kiev, and my panel was chaired by actually one of the founders of Stop Fake. And this is an organization of journalists and scholars who work on debunking Russian fake news stories. They have a great website, which is available in many languages, English being one of them, which I can drop in the chat actually after this. It's a really great resource for anyone who's looking to check things out and get an idea of what kind of considerations are important when vetting news stories. And they have some resources for like checklists, basically, for helping people do that, as well as you can just read through some of the stories and see, kind of what's told by Russian media versus what actually happened. This can help sort of create a lens through which you can view stories when you might come across them or hear them. It's a really good resource, definitely a fun one to click around a little bit, because you just get so much information out of that website. So that's a really great resource that I would just want to share today. I also did another conference more recently. This was in early April. So basically right around the time that we had received confirmation that we were, accepted to this conference was in late February. So it was obviously a very, a time of big change. And there was definitely a lot of focus on presenters who were talking about Ukraine, and just the amount of care and of sharing of information and resources that was going on at that conference and in those rooms was really inspiring. It was an in-person conference, but one of the presenters, Dr. Volodymyr Zelensky of Menshikov National University, was there presenting via Zoom, because he was actually in Odessa and was under siege at that time. And so that was a really kind of terrifying, but also very viscerally inspiring moment and reminder of the importance of information sharing. Here's this, yes, I'm being told to wrap up, sorry. So it's just a really visceral reminder of how important it is to continue sharing information and continue sharing good information. I'm so glad there are events like this that are geared towards getting information out of the university environment and accessible to everyone. We need to keep doing these meetings because these events are opportunities to focus people on the war and dispel any false information that is made its way into Canadian news outlets, etc. So I really want to encourage everyone here today to keep caring about it, keep talking about it, posting about it, and to keep Ukraine in your speech and on your mind, keep Ukraine visible. This is what translates into governments taking action and results in material aid being delivered where it's needed. Our world is very interconnected, and we're closer to Ukraine than we realize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I think Tamara is technically the next person to provide the transition to Oksana Kazima, the first secretary of the Ukrainian embassy. So, unmute yourself, Tamara.
Yeah. Sorry, Serhy, I didn't catch that. We are so grateful to have you joining us, Oksana Kuzima, and we welcome your reflections on all of our students who have inspired us today with how I'm just so proud of you, Vic, I have to say, and all that you have done. And I give the floor over to you for remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, dear friends. Thank you for this discussion, amazing discussion, which I really enjoyed. And what impressed me is the dedication of all of you, of all the students in helping Ukraine and Ukrainians. Today's event demonstrated that there are many things which we can learn from the younger generation. First of all, optimism. You are not afraid of leaving your life behind and go to a distant country to help peoples in need, to help Ukrainians who are fleeing from the war, to help those who really need your support. You are not afraid of being sanctioned, despite Russia wanted to put you on the sanctioned list to make you afraid, but I can see it only gives you strength. Secondly, I'm admired of your activism. You strive for knowledge and to use them for your benefit. You help in fighting Russian propaganda, Russian hybrid warfare by countering fake news, which is real huge impact into fighting this war. What is even more important, you see Ukraine's story in the wider context. For us, it's about protecting our land, which is a matter of survival for my nation. For you, it is more about that. It is also about the very concept of imperialism, of democracy, of human rights. And I really appreciate that in the academic community, you have the privilege to educate people and to raise awareness of this case. And I'm really grateful to you for that. I would like to express my gratitude to all these amazing people who made today's event possible. First of all, to Serhy Yekelchyk. I admire your dedication and your inspiration. Thank you, Serhy. And thank you, all of you. Please continue what you're doing. It is not only about Ukraine. It is about the world we live in and about the international peace and security, about our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana, much appreciated. Of course, I was working on this project together with my colleague, Tamara Krawchenko, but it really is the students who are at the heart of it. And I think I find myself in a situation of learning from students in this respect, because they do amazing things I didn't know about. And it's the situation of professors being challenged by life, by what their students do. They go well beyond over what we teach them. And this is one of those amazing occasions for us to be humbled by this and appreciate this. Thank you again, Oksana. We are going to proceed now with, we are going to call on our audience to post questions by using the Q&A function, which will be where you would normally find the icons for chat, participants, stop video down below. Please select the Q&A and post a few questions. we will moderate this discussion. Tamara and I will select the questions and ask them. In the meantime, I'm going to ask our technical assistant, the very capable Mike Thomas, to show the slide, and you can see it already. Now, the slides you're going to see have been prepared for other events run by the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies, and they therefore, for the general audience, they don't reflect what has been said today. So Devon, as you know, provided a reference to the organization right here on Vancouver Island, which badly needs your support. Ukraine Helps VI as one word, Ukraine Helps VI.ca. And I'm a huge believer now in, making difference locally, because that's what forces the global forces to change as well. And Canada-Ukraine Foundation would be my top choice among those three, because it's an organization working directly with Ukrainian organizations. And it was very thoughtful of our university to include also a slide to support Connect, because the things we have been discussing today, the discussion today has been powerful. But of course, one reason why it is so powerful is because it deals with tragic matters. So we need to be aware of the emotional impact of such things on our audience. And if any members of the university community feel that they need to talk over it, that they need help about making sense of the Russian aggression and the terrible drama in Ukraine, they are welcome to contact this line. Now, as I'm discussing the slides, I do hope that members of the audience would go ahead and post some Q&As, post some questions, and we will then select the responders among the panelists. Okay, we have a question, and it's a good one. It's for Sienna, technically, but I think I'm going to ask others to join Sienna in answering it, because we are not quite sure about what experience students have with that. Who would like to try?
I think maybe what is most needed on the front lines is the continued volunteers and the continued support, because like I said, especially where I was, there wasn't an overseeing organization. It was all, and that was the main sort of hub and center, first point of contact for a lot of the displaced Ukrainians coming over, and continuing to send financial aid and continue to send physical donations of a lot of just really necessary things like suitcases or baby items, and just physical bodies and hands, that anyone who has the opportunity and is able to assist or knows of people that is so important, that continued support, and making sure that people continue to pressure. Like I said, the mayor of Sheshmol is turning people away and trying to shut down the Tesco Center. So pressuring not only our domestic institutions of government, but also international institutions of government to continue to support and not grow weary of war.
Yeah, I think that was actually a very good answer here. Let's see. You probably know that in Ukraine, within Ukraine, as well as all around the globe, volunteering is a major factor in supporting the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian army. And this is yet another evidence that the Ukrainian political authorities, they do reflect the feelings of the entire society, that people are able and willing to mobilize completely in support of the Ukrainian war effort, defending itself against the Russian aggression. Okay, can we have some more questions, please, from the audience?
Yeah, we have another one up here. Let me just ask it, so in case everyone can't see. The question is from Olga. Thank you very much. How do you interpret the Canadian Liberal government's decision to send back the repaired Russian oil gas turbines for Germany? Zelensky called Canada as weak. This is a great question. I've been wondering this myself. And we all saw the photo op that was taken today with the turbine in Germany. So whoever would like to answer that one. Any thoughts from our panelists?
Yeah, sure, I can comment maybe. I think it's kind of, on the one hand, it's unfortunate that that is something that has happened, I think, because we do need to make sure as a nation that we are continuing to support Ukraine and definitely not taking steps backwards. And that's, I think, kind of the frustration that I felt when I saw this news story was like, it sets a dangerous precedent for taking steps back and taking steps away from our support of Ukraine. I suspect that what the Liberal government is trying to do is to balance their dedication to helping Ukraine with energy concerns in Europe and for Germany to make sure that, we're not creating more of an energy crisis. But it is disheartening to see that. And I hope that there will be no further actions taken in that direction. That's for sure. Yeah.
So if I may very quickly add up one point here, if you remember, Canada was not the first country to follow the example of the United States in providing Ukraine lethal weapons. The Canadian government really took its time thinking whether it could provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. In that, the Canadian foreign policy was more like some of some European country, really. And then, of course, the Ukrainian Canadian organizations did their part, pressuring, putting pressure on the government to provide lethal weapons and more training for Ukraine. But perhaps you would like to jump in, Devon? No?
Yeah, I agree with President Zelensky's sentiment on this. I agree that sanctions only work when they're enforced. And it's extremely disappointing that not only did this happen, but this happened when the press and the rest of the country weren't really paying attention. It felt like it was done in a very underhanded way. And I think it's very interesting that the Ukrainian World Congress has actually made moves to sue the Canadian government for this action. And a very reputable Ukrainian Canadian lawyer has actually taken on that charge and is taking action. So it's inspiring, I think, to see the Ukrainian diaspora saying, no, this is not okay. And there is also a student hunger strike currently taking place in Ottawa, where there's a group of university students who have been striking and who have not been eating. And that's been going on for at least a week, if not longer. So I think it's inspiring to see the Ukrainian community saying this is not okay and pressuring the government to do something about it, just as Zelensky called all of us to do in his address to the students. Yes,
thank you. Now we have a question from John, who identifies as the father of a UVic student. In the initial few weeks of the Russian invasion, we heard about anti-war protests in Moscow and other regions in Russia. Do we know what's happened with the protests since then? Who would like to answer this one?
I think Hannah. Great.
Yes, I can go ahead. So actually, I have actually friends and even relatives in Russia. You're quite right that in the first few weeks we saw kind of mass protests in Russia, but they were quickly wrapped up because the government actually used force to imprison those people. But I get that I continue reading news about separate Russian people who are protesting, either protesting or just posting something on social media, and who are actually detained almost every day. from students to just simple people from provincial Russian cities who just, stand in the street with just a piece of paper and nothing is written on it, and they are detained and imprisoned, unfortunately. But no more mass protests to the best of my knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's also, oh, apologies.
No,
I think
go
it's
ahead.
also worth noting that there are Ukrainians who are living in Russia who have now fled to Canada. Among those who have come with the Q8 visa, there are a number who have come from Russia specifically, who were Ukrainian, of Ukrainian ethnic heritage and were studying or working in Ukraine and felt that they were not safe, felt that it was not safe for them to be there and have fled the country.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm happy to follow up on this by saying that I do have at least 2 Russian colleagues who resigned their positions at Russian universities and left the country in protest. And it is encouraging that such people exist, but it is discouraging that the state was able to atomize the Russian society to such degree that it's impossible literally to create a united oppositional platform and to organize in larger numbers. And so that means Ukraine is not just fighting for itself, it is fighting for the chance for a Russian society to get organized against Putin's regime, hopefully. Good, so let's see if we don't have...
Yeah, we don't have any more questions, Serhy, but may I ask a final question perhaps, given the time?
Please do.
I'd like to ask all of our students, because they've inspired us today, how do you keep your hope? What gives you hope? How do you keep going with the work that you do? And for Secretary Oksana, I'd very much like to hear your opinion on that as well. You have a hard job. How do you keep hopeful?
I can start answering this question. We have no choice. It is our land, it is our home, and we see how Ukrainian soldiers, men and women in uniform, how brave they are in protecting our land. They're not discouraged by any propaganda, they're not discouraged by the fear of anything. They just go and bravely fight for their land. And that inspires, and that gives us hope, and that gives us strength to do as much as we can to do it here on Canadian soil.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Yeah, Sienna, over to you.
For me, it is, and it was the children, working with such young kids who largely seemed untouched in a way. They just still had a sense of childhood innocence around them. The young ones, older not so much, but you're just happy to be playing with somebody and having somebody to give them attention to, and still cheerful and just trying to do whatever you can to make sure that they continue to keep that livelihood and that innocence is really important, and what keeps me going and keeps my optimism, knowing that that's what we're fighting for.
Funny enough, I was going to say the same thing. Seeing the kids at our pop-up events, at our community events, we actually just had a free camp for the displaced children this past week. So seeing the kids enjoying themselves at summer camp and playing with Ukrainian Canadian children and hearing them talk about wanting to, go home and see Ukraine again is so inspiring, because they are the next, people say that the students are the next generation, but those children are the next generation. And seeing them and their joy and their love for Ukraine is just so hopeful. It's hard not to be inspired.
I think if I can offer one comment as well, I think for me it's maybe it's not hope, it's not optimism, but I think for me it's sort of more of a sense of duty, because I know that while I'm sitting at my desk and dealing with these sort of abstract things, information warfare, hybrid warfare, all these social media things, I also know that somewhere there is a soldier with boots on the ground who is dodging bullets. And so I think for me it's very much out of a sense of duty to the men and women, soldiers and civilians who are in Ukraine, who are fighting and who are teaching the world what true bravery means. So I think that's it for me.
Hannah, did you want to have a final word?
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with Alicia that I primarily find hope in the sense of duty, that you have to stick to your plans about research and your further work, because this is the only way you can help the society to know more about the ongoing war. And of course, you should try to protect your loved ones during those difficult times. It's also encouraging that you can do something for someone if you can, of course.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Our time is up. It has been a very interesting and invigorating event, which leaves you full of hope and enthusiasm and learning so much about what we can do in our everyday lives and what our students are doing. And it's important that we see the recognition of that effort both from the university and from the Embassy of Ukraine to Canada. I think it opens up the dialogue at a new level. And of course, the door was originally opened by President Zelensky's excellent address, but it is important that the address does not remain an event which is acknowledged and then, it recedes into the past and from the front pages. We need to keep talking about what we can do for Ukraine, and we need to keep acknowledging the people who do so much for Ukraine. And I think it is the most important that these people are students who are our future. Thank you all so much for your participation today. And I would like to acknowledge the support of the University of Victoria and the Embassy of Ukraine in Canada in organizing this event. And the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies took the initiative with the technical side, and Mike Thomas has been behind the technology on this side, and everything has worked out just fine. But above all, I would like to thank all of you who came to this event today, and those of you, I hope many more, who will be one day or perhaps already today and tomorrow watching this event on YouTube, because we will be trying to spread the word wider. And perhaps our hope here is to encourage other Canadian universities and Canadian students everywhere, perhaps through the network of SUSK, the Union of Ukrainian Canadian Students, in which Devon, of course, is involved, to do similar events, so that it's not just listening to the address and maybe asking a question, that it is actually following up with something meaningful and important, changing our lives and changing the lives of those we want to help in Ukraine and in Canada. Thank you so much again for joining.